Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another one of our Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy interview series, where we try to bring just super interesting people to talk a little bit about themselves and their work and maybe have a little conversation. It is my extraordinary pleasure today, and I really mean this from the bottom of my heart. This is like a great pleasure to have with us Ariana Hernandez-Reguant, a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago in 2002, which seems like only yesterday to me. And I will keep it that way. She is a visiting research assistant professor at the Cuban and Caribbean Studies Institute, and previously has held faculty positions at Tulane, which I love, by the way. I spent one happy semester there, and I wish I could go back. All right. At the Cuban and Caribbean Studies Institute at Tulane, and previously has held faculty positions at the University of California, San Diego, at the University of Miami, and at Tulane. She's a cultural anthropologist, which makes us very nervous because she can get right into our souls here without us even knowing. She's a cultural anthropologist studying the public expression of social and political ideologies, including ideologies of race, within institutions and social contexts of interpretation. She spent several years in Cuba during the 1990s and did field work at state media outlets, recording studios, and new advertising agency on the commercialization of culture and its impact on socialist governance. Everyone is commercializing culture nowadays. I only wish we could bottle it and sell it. We'd all be rich. But clearly it's not our forte. But that's what she's doing, and it's just super interesting. Lately, she's been doing research in Miami on Spanish language media and performances of race and citizenship among Cuban immigrants. Really super interesting work, and is in the process of finishing up writing her findings into a book, which I am desperately waiting for. So we may talk a little bit about that. At present, she's conducting new research on citizenship and notions of freedom in the Cultural Center of Cuban America, Hialeah, Florida, the great spiritual center, a donde hay mucho babalao, but I won't talk about that today. She's the author of several edited volumes, including Cuba and the Special Period, Culture and Ideology in the 1990s, a great book. I will put a link on when we put the interview up, and is published in Public Culture, the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology, NACLA, and other journals. Her publications have appeared in academic books and journals, as well as in the popular press, online blogs, and zines. I love these new words. I every time I think I finally learned English as my second language, a new word comes on and I'm just, I gotta go and start again. So blogs and zines and art tabloids. Ariana is a founder and moderator of the International Network of Cuba Scholars that coalesce in the Ethno-Cuba Facebook group, a fabulous, fabulous group. I learned so much from that book. Thank you, by the way. So I want to take this opportunity before this poor woman has been waiting to speak, and I'm just gushing here, but this is just fabulously important. So thank you for putting that together. It's got over 700 members, really interesting conversations. Since 2015, she's been the editor-in-chief of Cuba Counterpoints. Again, a brilliant zine. I'm trying to use my new word, a brilliant zine, some extraordinary contributions in there. And then every once in a while, she lets me in there too. But there's also some really good stuff in there. A web zine on Cuban and Cuban American affairs, culture, and the arts that is the public voice of the scholarly Cubanist community. I really am delighted to have you here. Thank you so much. I had to read all that bio because I want you to have an increase in the fans that you have. And I was wondering if maybe we can start about maybe by talking about you. All right. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about how you got interested in Cuba and Cuban American studies, and more specifically, what drives your work, your political path, your professional, not political, we'll get to that maybe, but your professional passions?
I became interested in Cuba by chance. Like, I mean, that's how life happens in the end. It's all by chance. Because I went to graduate school to study South Africa, and specifically to do field. I wanted to live in Johannesburg and Pretoria and study the transition from apartheid. And I had this idea. I was working in Washington D.C. in the early 90s on housing, and particularly fair housing. And so I was interested in residential segregation and urban stuff. And you know, the greatest South African anthropologists and South Africanists were John and Jean Komarov, that were at the University of Chicago. So so that's what I wanted to do. And but increasingly, you know, studying Zulu was a challenge. I realized that I will never master the language. So I always thought that you know, that to do field work, you need to know the language well enough so that you can understand what you overhear. So it's not just communication, but it's just like you're sitting somewhere, people are talking, you need to know. You need to be able to eavesdrop and understand what they're talking. And I realized that I will never be good enough for eavesdropping. So at the same time, there was a Stanford undergraduate at the time that was caught in racial violence. I think it was in Cape Town. And so I had sort of this crisis of faith, right? And thinking, well, you know, like, do I really want to go to a place you know, in conflict with very difficult African languages, and you know, and I asked people that had returned from the field in anthropology, graduate students, how much they enjoyed their fieldwork years. I also thought, you know, like, the years of research in the field are like the best. This is the adventure of your life. And so I asked a friend of mine who had done research on violence in prisons in Northern Ireland. And I said, well, how were your years of fieldwork? And she said, oh, so interesting. Well, but did you have fun? I was like, well, no, fun, I didn't have fun. You know, it was dramatic. I was like, okay. And then I asked somebody who had done some completely relevant research in the Seychelles. And I said, how were your years of fieldwork? Well, intellectually, I mean, you know, but do you have fun? Oh, yeah, the best years of my life, the best beaches. And then I thought, I mean, you know, life goes by very quickly, and, you know, we also have to have fun. So I was in this crisis of faith when the University of Chicago opened exchanges with the University of Havana. And it was the first time, I guess, ever that you know, under Clinton, that US universities were doing exchanges. And the first ones were Chicago, Texas, and Florida, I believe. And so I was one of the, you know, so then it was open for faculty, but faculty were not signing up. So they opened it up to graduate students. I guess, you know, there were no Cubanist faculty, and people had other things to do than, you know, go in 1994 to spend a summer in Cuba. And so I immediately volunteered. And we were a group of like 4 or 5 graduate students that were the first ones to, you know, to make it there. And once I arrived there, it was 95, I don't know, like late spring, I would say. And you know, and it was really hard, and no food, and everybody knows what it was back then. But I felt like, oh my God, you know, that was like the adventure of a lifetime. And so that's it. I switched and I went back to my advisors, and I said, you know, I said to John Komarov that I didn't think, first I went to her, to Jean, and I told her that I was not going to study Cuba anymore. And she looked at me astonished, and she said, okay, well, then you'll study Zimbabwe. And I said, no, I don't think so. And, you know, she didn't really have an interest in Cuba at the time, but he did. And so you know, I kept pretty much the same committee, and just did this switch, and the rest is history. And because I think that nobody, you know, nobody was doing ethnographic, like extensive fieldwork in Cuba, that I was able to get grants, like, you know, NSF, and, you know, all sorts of grants to be there. So that's it. And basically on and off, I stayed there through 99. Then I came back. So, you know, and so what, you know, I think, it's kind of interesting to think about what drives your work, and it's because it's something that you often you find it in retrospect, you know, I don't know about you in your academic career, but, you know, you do project after project, and very often it seems that one project has nothing to do with the next, and you just stumble into something else that it's interesting, or that, you know, that happens to be an opportunity. And sometimes I thought, you know, when putting together CVs, like, I don't know how this ties with this, you know, this is like a jump. And you know, but looking back, I think that one of the questions that has always driven me is, why do people believe what they believe? And it's a very contemporary question now with the misinformation and conspiracy theories and so on. But I was always interested in, you know, in who people trust. Why do we take for granted certain ideas and we question others? And, you know, and so this idea that became also, you know, like Sloterdijk and these theories that post-Frankfurt School that became more current, I think the fall of socialism, it posed that question, you know, the question of cynicism, the question of government legitimacy. And so I think that all the projects that I've done and lots of other things that I've done in life, I think that it was in pursuit of this question, which in a way I've sort of given up on it, because, you know, right now with what's happening in the United States, I'm as puzzled as anybody else, you know. How hard it is for so many people to discern what's logical, what's not logical, what makes sense, what sources to trust, right? And I was talking to a friend last night a little bit about this, and for instance, like she didn't like that now Facebook, you know, adds a line that says this is questionable, or this hasn't been proven. Like, she thinks that you should be able to tell lies, and it's up to people to figure it out. So like Big Brother telling you this is right or wrong, this is very problematic. Whereas I'm thinking that in this world of misinformation, the solution is long-term. And so this is just like a Band-Aid. And so, hey, you know, like, why not? So, but in any event, you know, like, that was a question that that guided me, and you know, in Cuba, and then later, and then also here in my later work about Cubans for Trump, right? I mean, when there was a conversation, you know, like when I went to do fieldwork into a state radio station, a government radio station in Cuba, how did people that were, whose mission was to put up a discourse on the airwaves about socialism and about prosperity in a socialist country, because it was a station for tourists, where I did most of my field work, how did they, you know, how did they navigate all of a sudden having a foot on this foreign company world, where value is calculated in a very different way? It's value and values, you know? And so how can you support, you know, be, you know, how can you fulfill your mission of putting out a discourse on the goodnesses of socialism when you are seeing firsthand the contradictions that this commercialization is posing, right? How can you put out a discourse of, you know, the value of labor when clearly what's valuable is speculation? And so, you know, so even people, you know, I interview people that they had to do radio ads, and I have a beautiful interview with the guy who made his first radio ad ever. And it was for a company that, you know, that was gonna advertise for the first time in this radio station. And then the company wanted to pay him, and he had no idea how to value his work, because doing an advertising was part of his meager salary as the station, as it is, you know, putting records on or archiving tapes or something. And but then he had to figure out what to charge, and he had no guidance, he had no idea, but he knew that he had to, even if it was under the table, because thanks, you know, like they figured out, these professionals, that thanks to, you know, before they worked for a salary, and at the radio station, and the money that the radio station made will be redistributed among everybody for the prosperity of all. So that's fine. I'm making what I'm making because this is for the community. But now my work is making these people money, thanks to, like, they figure out that even the actors in the commercials, that if they were more enthusiastic, the product will sell more and the company will make their money. Therefore, their enthusiasm had a price. Otherwise, they would just read the lines without enthusiasm, and who's going to buy that, right? And so that was fascinating to me, how people began to value the quality of their work in ways that before it hadn't even occurred to them, right?
Wow. Okay.
And
No,
so, yeah.
no, it's just fascinating. And I wanted to pick up a thread of what you were saying, because I hear what you're saying, but I come from, again, a very different perspective. And mine is the perspective of semiotics,
Okay.
as opposed to cultural anthropology. So I'm sitting here as you're talking, trying to put together what I see are three blocks of signs and of meaning symbols, right? Lies, culture, and ideology. And when you add cultural depth to those markers, you can ask, well, when you talk about this, you really do begin to see this connection between ideology, which to some extent is involved in a conversation that produces culture, which then makes it possible to discern at some level something that is compatible with cultural ideology, which is truth, and something which is incompatible with cultural ideology, that is, there's a dissonance in meaning, which then is lies. If that's the case, then a lot of times what we may be talking about is not necessarily lies in the sense that the sun is yellow. No, the sun is black, right? Those kind of things. Rocks are hard. But actually, what we begin talking about, lies and truth, are really lies and truths in the ways in which we perceive, or we're permitted to perceive, and therefore are able to both interpret and draw meaning. And so all of a sudden, all of these things, and your example of the Cuban guy at the radio station is just perfect when you talk about this, because in a sense, then you wind up, at least from a semiotic ears of cultural anthropology, you wind up completely destabilizing the notion of lies, or rather you embed it much more deeply in a cultural ideological way of interpreting, and therefore drawing meaning, and therefore discerning truth.
No, but except I'm not sure. I don't think I agree with your premise, because we know that neither truth nor lies were elements in decisions over legitimacy discourse. We all know that what you hear in advertisements are a lie, but we know that this product is not gonna, it's not gonna make you feel like you're Superman, or it's not gonna make you younger, or that this restaurant is not the best place for your wedding, but we have a lot of tolerance to, to stretch. And what we know from also people who, anthropologists that work in Russia, and we know also in theory from, the idea of slaughter, about kineticism and so on, is that people did not need to believe that what the leaders said, for instance, in socialist regimes, but not only, they didn't need to know that it was true. Very often when Fidel Castro spoke, people didn't take him literally. So also the notion of truth and lies, it's almost irrelevant. So that gives it like again, more depth, because you trust this leader, knowing that he's doing promises that he's not going to fulfill, or you trust this product even, when it's telling you that it's going to do things for you or create this world for you, it's not true, but you still might buy it, so so what we know is that the issue of truth and lies is not the road toward understanding, ideology, legitimacy, trust, or anything like that. And I think this is also key to understand, why many people will support Trump, even knowing that he tells so many lies. That, like he might tell thousands of lies, but that really doesn't matter. And it's not because truth doesn't matter, but it is because trust doesn't really lie there. It's like your children trust you, even if you tell them that it's three kings that bring them presents in the January 5th. And eventually they find that's a lie. And very often they, like when I found out, I pretended I didn't know for as long as I could, so that I kept receiving the presents, right? And
Right.
so we enter into this complicity, and so the trust doesn't reside there.
All right. Well, this is fascinating. And again, so now I'm curious. We use trust as a kind of as sort of the glue that holds this together in a sense. But when you talk about trust, what do you mean? So, for example, an employee may not trust the human resources department at their university, but they still have to work around them. They don't believe a thing, and they don't trust them, but they deal with them. But you're talking about something very different. So I was wondering, maybe if you can talk to me a little bit about what do you mean more precisely about trust, and
well,
how.
in the sense of relinquishing the power of governance. That's what I mean.
Oh.
Right. And because this is how, ideology and hegemony is thought to be, is thought to be sort of like the structure that fosters a belief. And that's why people do not revolt against this structure, right? Because it's a social contract. It's like we have a social contract, and we relinquish some of our power and sort of space for action in the state. Okay. Right? But we do need to have some trust that they are going to do their part of the social contract, right? And ideology is normally what holds this trust together, but ideology is different from truth. There doesn't have to be a truth for you to agree to this relinquishing.
Okay, so this relinquishing, this is wow. Okay, so I'm actually in my head are exploding pictures of Santa Teresa and San Juan de la Cruz, of the old mystics, because if the Spanish Christian mystics of the 16th and 17th century, because the way I hear you talking about trust, you really, to my ears, and tell me why I'm completely wrong. And this is more devil's advocate-y kind of thing. What I'm hearing is trust invariably in a cultural context involves a surrender of some kind, a giving up, perhaps of autonomy, perhaps of consciousness, a giving in, and there's almost a religious element to this, the way in which you surrender to God.
Or transactional. It's also transactional, not necessarily religion. It's convenience, and it's transactional. There's there's an ethnography that Berkeley anthropologist Alexei Yurchak did on late socialism in Russia, and taking this, he takes this idea of Sloterdijk, that people didn't need, people did not need to know the specifics of either ideological positions or policy. People knew who had the power, right? And the measure of power, and this is something that I also saw in Cuba from the 90s onward, the measure of power, it's the ability that the government has to in controlling the discourse. It doesn't matter if that discourse it's a complete lie. Most people don't listen anyway, right? It's like, you know, when you have like Fidel Castro talking for 5 hours nonstop, that becomes noise. But it's that noise for 5 hours that is signaling to you who has the power and not necessarily what he's saying, right? And so it's when you don't have that noise anymore that then, you know, there's a void.
Okay.
Right?
Well, that's really interesting. So that all right, and that's perfect. I mean, brilliant. So that in effect, the suggestion is, if I hear you right, and tell me if I get this, that it really doesn't matter what comes out of the mouth in a context of trust. And so
And in a context of
secondary
Trump,
or irrelevant, it's the trust.
yes. And so, I've seen it here. You know, I say it in the NACLA article, and I know we are fast forwarding now, but, you know, I'm thinking through this because, like I say in that article, many people that I talked to that they were Trump voters, they didn't care about the minutia of policy at all. They were not going to vote for this president on the basis of any single policy. So it is more as the sort of the ideological infrastructure that is being provided, you know. It doesn't have to be truths, because they'll tell you all politicians lie. Or when you would say, well, how about the pandemic, how it has been mismanaged? Oh, well, you're saying that because you're not in his shoes, but nobody knew. The Spaniards did it wrong and the Chinese did it wrong, and nobody knows, you know, like everybody has been operating by trial and error. And so, you know, so that's giving the benefit of the doubt, right? So there is a sort, you know, a sort of trust that has been relinquished, that doesn't matter how many times you might point out about all the lies that have been told.
Okay, so in effect, politics is really the signaling, the signage of trust, because the same would apply then to the problems, for example, in the contest for the Democratic presidential nomination between Sanders and Biden. You've got the same trust kind of thing. It didn't matter what they said. What it mattered was producing the signs, the signals that would then produce the trust necessary, so that everything else was, you had to make noise. It almost didn't matter what you said once you got whatever sign was necessary to develop trust.
Right. And I mean, you know, this is food for thought, because it's not like I have, you know, all the answers written down. But I think that the fact that Bernie Sanders repeated the same thing over and over and over in every interview, he always repeated the same 5 ideas and never strayed, I think that contributed to the trust. You know, this was not an unpredictable person. And I would think that, but then, you know, it's kind of interesting, because some of these arguments also, you see that there's more when they switch, because, you know, he was not unpredictable, therefore he was trustworthy. But then in the cases of other politicians, they've been there for half a century, so it's time to move on, right?
You can trust them, but you don't want them anymore.
Right, yeah, right. But yeah, the issue is that it's not, that's why I'm saying it's not about the minutia of policy, it's about the pomp, about the performance, about the, you know, the symbols that are being activated. And so I think that this is, you know, this has been my thread throughout, you know, understanding what is it that, you know, that mobilizes people toward action, and what is it that, you know, and also at what point because that was also the like I remember when when the fall of the Soviet Union happened, there were all these scholars, as you know, sociologists mostly and political scientists, trying to figure out why it fell when it fell, right? That was the $1,000,000 question. Was it like elites that had split, a middle class that had emerged and had make exerted pressure on elites and so on? So there were all these theories trying to find out why. At the time, I read, I think it was first year graduate school, I read a book that it's an old sociology book, which you might have read, that I've never forgotten. And I think it's the best sort of case study ever for every discipline in the social sciences, which is by a guy called John Gaventa, Power and Powerlessness in an Appalachian Valley.
Yes.
That was the best book I read in my entire undergraduate and graduate years, and that completely spoke to me, because it's the reverse question. It's not why this happened, but is it why it doesn't happen, right? And at what point, is there going to be social mobilization, right? And will there ever be? And what do you need for that to happen? Right. And in his case.
Right. And not just social mobilization, but enough social mobilization coordinated enough to bring down, right, to overcome a kind of singular inertia.
And also a coherent ideology that has an enemy. Because in his case, there was no enemy, because the miners could never find what company, what office, or what, like the power of these companies was so diffuse and extended throughout the world, and executives that, they didn't really know what their target was.
Right. And that's, I mean, in a sense, that's fascinating. It really does suggest, though, why it is that the Americans have so much less to worry about when it comes to overthrowing a system. Whose building do you burn down in the US? But in Cuba, it would be the reverse.
Right. And exactly. And I think that Trump has also exploited that idea, because when he keeps talking about the deep state, you don't know what it is. Where are you going to go after the deep state,
That's right. What is it? Who's in it? And there's so many of them, as we've now come to understand.
There's no target.
One for another, right?
Yeah.
But in other jurisdictions, I mean, and that is actually perhaps one of the Achilles heels of Leninism and Leninist ideology, this absolutely singular movement towards clearly identifiable centers, unitary centers, makes them both ultimate power, but also ultimate instability. You know exactly where you've got to go. Right.
And who to overthrow.
Exactly. And that makes for it becomes much more precarious, even though it's more powerful and efficient, than a crazy society where you have no idea where the head is.
Right.
Because every time you think you chop one off, well, 4 others come up and they all tell you, no, you cut off the wrong head.
Right.
And the wrong ideology, because we've got a market full. It reminds me, in a sense, of the old markets in Cuba, de plátano y de cosa, So you get rid of a couple of plantain vendors, but you still got all this other stuff going on. Bueno, entonces como huevo en vez de pollo, and there you go. The market remains, right? When it's different like that. But if the only thing I have is one thing that I'm going to give you, and it's from one stand.
And this is why the Black Lives Matter movement has been so powerful, because it has a target and it has a goal.
For as long as that target remains viably constructed. And that's the problem there, I think. The minute that one can deconstruct the target as not merely an abstraction, but as a construct that doesn't hold water.
But it is, because, and I think this is also why it is brilliant in a way, because its target is not necessarily, or not only, the federal government, because the federal government, there's so much that it can do. Its target, it's counties and cities. Like when you see that the city of Miami Beach, where I live, 60% of its total budget goes to safety.
Really?
Yes. And I think Miami-Dade County, it's about 50%. And this is pretty much average in most cities. So if you think of all the, all the money that's generated through property taxes, through sales taxes, and you look at the budgets, local budgets, half of that money goes to safety. It's the parallel of the federal government and the defense budget, at the local level. And this is what, this is something that activists are targeting in many cities and in many counties and towns. So,
but there's a danger there as well, because just as there is a sense of betrayal in devoting most of your money to policing, there will be an equal amount, or there has been, at least traditionally in this country, an equal amount of disdain when all of that money goes towards services in which the state appears to be managing your most intimate relations, the way you raise your kids, what you teach them, how you live. Is your house clean enough? Do you have who's the person you're sharing your house with? How many of them are there? I recall back in the old days, in the 60s and 70s, in welfare programs, for example, the notion of the intrusive state now re-engineering the families of the poor, and then holding over them the power to either keep money or take your kids away, became in a way as oppressive. We didn't call it a police power. We called it, we're reinventing. It was almost a quasi-Leninist project, the ideal family. But its pinch might have been felt in a very different way, but still would have been felt with the same intensity that you feel when you turn to purely the techniques of an occupying power. And so how you deal, the question then, it brings up the larger question, which is the old question: should the state intervene at all? And, or should it intervene in culture rather than directly? And then now you've got complexity. And so, which is why I suggest that, yes, it's brilliant for the time they can maintain that sense of targeting, but the minute that becomes problematic, and it'll become problematic when you move from target to solution, then the danger of this thing falling apart becomes larger.
But it depends on how, excuse me to interrupt. Are you sure that the windows change?
Well, you're going to be up in front. They see me way up on top. It'll be cool.
Okay, all right.
I
think this
more
is
interested in seeing you than me.
Okay. I think this is this issue. It's sort of like the $1 million question now with the Democratic Party. How is it going to retool its discourse so that it can counteract, for instance, the idea of socialism. Socialism is bad. The Democratic Party is socialist, and we don't want socialism, right? How do you, the Republican Party has succeeded without focusing on specific policies, with very few exceptions like abortion or, or taxation. But in general, it's a little bit of an empty vessel. I was giving the example the other day of this guy that I took pictures of that was circling an early voting location in Hialeah with a flag, with a pole with 3 flags. Did you see the picture? And it's it's the Trump flag, the U.S. flag, and the marijuana flag. And I asked him, wait, but Trump does not support the legalization of marijuana. And he says, but I do. So, but that's like within it's, so I wrote something about, like, it was like within the revolution, everything; against the revolution, nothing. So it's the same within Trump, everything; against Trump, nothing, and I think this is how you create these ideologies and these ideological loyalties, not going into the minutiae of policy, because within this ideological umbrella, there's room for a lot. And I think that this is what the Democratic Party has to figure out now, when you saw the, for us, particularly academics and so on, when Trump and the non-debates of Biden and Trump, that it was Biden alone, Trump alone, but it was at the same time. So you were switching through channels, remember? I mean, one was just, empty, bombastic stuff. And the other one, Biden, was really interesting because the guy knew everything. He could tell you about everything from fracking to the environment to the percentages of people that this, that, and the other. This was clearly a very well-informed person that knew his stuff, right? But, but that's not about politics, right? That, you still need an overarching message and
Well, that's right. That's right. He would have gotten an A on the exam. He would have gotten an A on the exam.
He would have gotten an A in the exam, right?
But
will people take his class? No.
That's right. That's right. So it's interesting, though, to see the parallels here between the way in which ideology, culture, trust operates in two societies that are supposed to be diametrical opposites,
right?
And yet, instead of seeing it on a spectrum, what we see is a circle, right? Because the parallels are just fascinating.
Yes,
they'll show differently, but we worry about, and we have the same kind of human proclivities to the same sorts of default performance patterns, which then produces, in contextually different ways, of course.
And I think that people have forgotten the power of populism and the power of nationalism. These were ideologies that mobilized people throughout the 20th century. Nothing more powerful than nationalism. And I think that toward the end of the 20th century, there began to be all these very technocratic governments, right? It was governments by experts. And that was supposed to be a good thing, like we are beyond that tribalism. Now we want experts to solve problems. And I think that what we see is that, no, we cannot turn the page, like, yes, we want a government by experts, but those ideologies were very, they are very resilient, and they were very powerful for many reasons, and they still are.
Right. And you saw that actually both in the US and to some extent in Cuba in the context of COVID, where in fact there was the politics circled around the notion of, must we constantly bend the knee to science? And if we do, which science, whose science, and is it the science of the economist? Is it the science of the scientist? And what end?
Yeah.
So you saw that in the United States to a lesser extent, but you saw that discussed in Cuba as well.
Right.
In the context of everything, well, we're going to do all these things in Cuba, but then why are our doctors going to Italy? And why is it that in a context in which we have to do this, there's no clean water? So how do you expect me to keep everything clean and sanitized if I turn on the faucet and I have no water and I have no electricity? So those kinds of things, just again, another mirror. So, but I'm wondering, this is just a fascinating discussion. We can do this like for hours, but I wanted I've got a question for you. Going back to your early work in the 90s on the commercialization of culture and its impact on socialist governance. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more. We've talked a little bit about it, but I wanted to focus in a little bit more on this work and perhaps suggest some insights that can be of value as we look to the future, both in Cuba and in Cuba's cultural center in Miami. This notion of commercialization of culture and its impact, well, of socialist governance in Cuba, certainly from Havana and Miami, but of governance in general.
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking.
Well, it's the story of the gentleman at the station who all of a sudden got money for being enthusiastic. Right? We know about culture and governance, but when one then begins to develop its commercial aspects, one bottles it, one creates containers for it, one views it as a product, and then one exports it. I mean, to what extent does that help shape or reshape the way in which we understand in Cuba, we understand socialism, for example, and in Miami, perhaps the way we understand the relationship of the Miami Cuban community, for example, to the home country. The commercialization element of politics, and especially cultural politics, had been relatively anathema. We never talked about politics, political discourse, and ideology in commercial terms, that is, in terms of markets, except American judges who every once in a while, although they were stark raving mad in a sense because they really didn't know what they were talking about, the marketplace of ideas. It was some kind of Socratic market where what we were really talking about was the turnip markets in some rural town, which is much, how shall we say, messy than these elite intellectual markets. But politics can be commercialized. That is, it can be constructed to be bought and sold. It can be packaged for export. It can be repackaged for internal distribution. It has a value that, I mean, and that's really what struck me when you were talking about that gentleman. All of a sudden he wakes up and he goes, oh my God, there's value in this. There's value in speech. There's value in appearing to be emotional. To what extent do you see that commercialization becoming not just endemic, but now normal, as opposed to the traditional way, for example, that one might view cultural politics as something that is detached from, and that in fact might view commercialization as something that's dirty or beyond it?
Well, I'm like, I'm not completely sure I follow, but I think that there is a split. There is a split everywhere between, the commercialization of culture and the arts, and and the art market, and intellectual property regimes, and struggles, and conflicts for authorship and for maximizing profits. But still, in the last 15 years or something in the United States, the notion of what's called, social practice art has become really, really strong, which is different from activist or political art. And, I think that there are many artists that are developing both practices. And, like on the one hand, artifacts for buy and sell, and on the other hand, an art practice that it's a community practice, that it's a socially conscious practice. I think the foremost example in the Cuban context is probably Tania Bruguera. She has theorized it, and she has formulated that, and she has, and she has really engaged in both. And I think that and I think that we see here too. And so the old notion of cultural production and art production for the good of all hasn't gone away. The market has not taken over. The market, we have Art Basel in Miami every year, not this year for the pandemic, but that is a huge marketplace of art. But it's self-contained, that's a market. But some of these things, you can call it art, or you can call it design, or or you can call it decoration for your home, or collectors, so that that they expect these things to raise in value. Most often they don't.
So what you're really talking about then two different cultures of value, right? So
well, we see it in music too, but music, it's even more dramatic. When when the market of recorded music kind of collapsed with social media, and so unless you are like a huge star, musicians make money in in live performance mostly, right? And so this is also a turn of events that it sets musicians back 100 years, right? And so I think it's the same in all the arts. And so I think that in Cuba in the 90s, they tried to commercialize the arts and the media and so on by by pegging it on the one hand to an art market, and then on the other hand to a market of anything, so that artists could work in advertisement and so on, right? So that was that was a way to generate income, but there are still plenty of of cultural production and music and art that that is not within those circuits. And I think that the most astonishing development has been that in the US, the sort of reputable artists and theorists and curators have gone this social route instead, and even looked down on the art market, which is just a way to make money. But art,
Well,
it's something else.
but then how do you value social art? I mean, I'm hearing basically two value systems. One more commercial or traditional commercial in nature, but the other one has value too. But it sounds like value,
It's
the
in
foundations.
dispute. It's in dispute, and that brings to mind a case that I worked on as an expert witness, a legal case.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
it was here in Miami when I first came. You surely know the Chinese dissident artist Ai Weiwei.
Yeah.
He had an exhibit here at the PAM, and it was a body of work that he was doing that was very interesting, that was questioning the value of artifacts. And so he was exhibiting all these vessels, ceramic pots and so on, that allegedly peasants could dig out in many regions in China, that they belong maybe to the Ming dynasty or something. And so, and the same copies, they were actually sold at regional markets for use. But that project of his consisted on him digging out or buying from peasants some of these pots that were said to have archaeological value, and he was then stamping his initials, and then that was becoming an art piece that costed a lot more than when he bought it from, and it was like nobody wasn't sure whether, and he didn't disclose it, whether they were true archaeological artifacts or he just had bought them at the at the market. But but that was his project of like, once I stamp my my sort of fame, my fame value to it, my popularity, it goes up in price just because it has my name. And so along with this exhibit, and this is the background, there was a video of his in which he takes one of these vassals and then drops it.
Ah.
And the message is that he can do that because he owns it, And so he, as the artist under capitalism, he's the one that sets the value of his art. So it's his signature, really, what has value here, not the piece. Okay, so this was the exhibit that traveled around, went to Toronto, and then came to the museum, the PAM Museum, and the main art museum in Miami. So this guy that I never heard of, allegedly a Dominican artist, who was allegedly not, not like a successful artist at the time. He went to this exhibit. He grabbed one of the pots, and as he, and the installation had several pots, 7 or 8 or 9 or something on the floor, and then there was the video. So he grabs one, and at that moment, a security guard says, "What you doing? What you doing? Don't touch that." And then he goes, and he drops it. And so it breaks in a million pieces. They arrest him and throw him in jail for like 3 days or something, and and then they accuse him of destroying art. He has destroyed art. This is going to cost him a fortune, and Ai Weiwei of all people. And so I wrote a piece in his defense at the time, and that's how I ended up as an expert witness. So I wrote a piece saying that, in my view, because then Weiwei reacted by saying that he was an asshole, and that next time he should buy his own pot and break it, but not come and break mine. And to me, that was so unbecoming of Weiwei, and so small-minded, because in my view, what this other guy did, he's called Maximo Caminero. What Maximo did, he only went a step further with Weiwei's work, because you know, like Weiwei showed that by putting his signature on it, this was worth more. But what these other guys show was what was happening in the stock market with junk bonds and so on. He showed that anybody can come in and they're going to drop it. And you know what? Now it's worth nothing. And so in my view, this was like the leg that Weiwei was missing. To me, that was the completion of the performance, you know, some random person coming in. But you know, so I wrote something somewhere in some blog, and then next thing I know, I'm invited around town to give talks, and you know, and people are kind of like, you know, like trying to put money together to get this poor artist out of jail. And when they ask him why he did it, he really doesn't have an answer. You know, I think he went mad for a minute, or maybe he wanted his 1 minute of fame or something. So his lawyer, who was an ACLU public interest lawyer, his lawyer contacted me. And because not only, you know, like this guy was charged with, you know, 1 million hours of community service, and then they wanted him to pay millions of dollars for having broken this thing. And so the question was, how do you establish the value of this piece? So now there's not only Weiwei's performance, this guy performance, but now they want to monetize it. And, you know, because there's an insurance here, and the insurance doesn't want to pay for this. This guy has to pay for this. So how is it decided how much it is this piece that this guy broke, right? And the insurers and the collectors and so on, and Weiwei, they claim that he broke a piece that costed, that's you know, that in the market, what Weiwei's works go for, this cost millions. So the lawyer calls me up and says, how can you help? And I said, one way or another, I'll figure it out. So I thought and thought and thought and thought, and then it kind of dawned on me and something. So I requested videos of all the places where this installation had traveled before. And I realized that the number of pots was different in every installation. So here there were 7, and in the place before there were 8, and in the place before there were 6. Therefore, the value of the installation of the piece was an installation, was not altered by having one more or less pot in it.
Oh my God.
Therefore, it's worth nothing. This single pot by itself is worth nothing.
Right, it's the show itself.
It's the show, and the show has traveled, and it had different number of pots, you know? And so, and even I think somebody told me that, of course, sometimes handlers break them, you know, and Weiwei has like a bunch at home, so he sends another one. And so breaking 1 out of 8 does not alter. You can have the same piece with just 7. You don't need the 8, right? And so that's what made it. And then at the end, I think he only had to pay like $100,000 or $25,000 or something. Yeah.
Only.
Yeah, right.
And so I'm horrified.
This was well, no, that's a lot, but they wanted him to pay 1 or 2 million, you know. So at the end, I don't know what it was. Maybe it was not 100, maybe it was 10,000. He paid, I don't know, something, something
more
really
than
minor compared
wow.
with what they wanted, you know. But, you know, that was like, in that case, my way to answer the question of how much is this worth? And my started thinking was, this is worth nothing. And I'm going to show that this is worth nothing, you know?
Right. And then, of course, the question is, what is it that is valued? Is it the installation as a whole? Is it the pot?
It is. Well, it's not the pot, clearly.
Right. Is it the signature?
Right.
Or is it the offense to the majesty of the artist, that what you're valuing is way
that's what they were valuing, you know. But I think actually that the whole performance process was super valued by the intervention of this random actor. but that, but that's my view. But anyway, it's a little bit of a tangent, but it's how you value a piece of art is contextual. There's no inherent value. That's the market, obviously. That's the problem with the market.
Right. But it's funny, you're talking about this story, and I'm hearing, for me, this is almost a metaphor for the the breakables that are the various parts of political ideology in virtually every country. You really have, in some, culture tends to be a very harsh mirror, and humans tend to be very simple. We repeat the patterns over and over and over again in different things. But if you think about it, that story you just relayed and your intervention in it is really a remarkable metaphor for the contextually different political ideologies that one sees in both Cuba and the United States.
So how far can you go before the ideology itself falls apart? How
Right.
much can you push? And you can push a lot.
Right. You can push a lot, and then that moment, moment comes, the wall comes down, and you have no way of knowing when, how, if. All it took was this random guy in one exhibit. And now all of a sudden, because he got his $10,000, but at the same time, now people are freer to mock. And by mocking, devalue. And by devaluing, all of a sudden, you now are setting things in motion. And so you've got this, in fact, the whole world in here, in terms of the performance, effectively, of political ideology. This is just fabulous. But let me, I know I'm exhausting you. This has been
but we're going off in many tangents, but I hope
it's fine. But I want to go off on yet another tangent. I find your work on Cuban counterpoints and Ethno-Cuba, the website, to be just extraordinary and extraordinarily helpful. You talk about, if you're looking at social art, in a sense, this is social discourse, which is profoundly useful, for which you gift effectively to everyone. I was wondering if maybe you can talk a little bit to us. This is a little bit of propaganda for you.
Well, because Cuba Counterpoints is dormant because it has no funding. So, the site is there, but there's no movement, unfortunately. But it actually all started way before with a blog that actually was the idea of my dear friend and colleague, Paul Ryer, who was another anthropologist that came to Cuba. We were the same cohort at Chicago. No, he was 1 year ahead, but the same cohort, the same little group that we first went to Cuba. And he wanted to do a blog called Ethno-Cuba for just like the handful of anthropologists that could write their stuff. And I said, no, I want something for the public. I want us to make commentary that is relevant to everybody. So from our experience and knowledge, that we talk to the public. And so, so everything started there, and that must have been, I don't know, maybe 2008 or something like that. So, and so we had guests, bloggers as well. And I wrote an article on Radio Martí, also making the case that if you, like the government at the time wanted to defund NPR, but give more funds to Radio Free, the Voice of America. And so I made the case that, that if you do one, you also need to do the other. And this was picked up by, newspapers and so on, right? This, bringing them the two together. And so that's, that's what I wanted. I wanted things to circulate. Then at the same time, about the same time, I was very frustrated with how LASA Cuba was handled. And I guess I still am, but I'm not involved anymore. But at the time, I didn't agree at all how elections were conducted, and and the relative power of people in Cuba and people outside Cuba, and how the Cubans were elected. There seemed to be always the same 5 people rotating year after year, after a decade, and after several decades. And so, so I wanted change, and I ran for elections. And then all of a sudden, everything blew up. There were irregularities. The election was invalidated. And then it was repeated. And all of a sudden, in the repeated, there were new candidates on the Cuban side. Whereas if you repeat the election, you have to have the same candidates, you know, we will vote again, but for the same rooster of people. And all of a sudden, the people had changed. I mean, like the whole thing was so irregular. And somebody that to this day, I don't think anybody has ever heard of, that year won, won my slot for one vote. And I was already, I was doing the Ethno-Cuba blog, and I think I had started the Facebook group, but we were just a few anthropologists. And I said, I'm gonna launch a group of Cubanist scholars that, LASA can do its thing, but, there was censorship as well. There was a year that I proposed a table that was censored, and other people had the same experience. So yes, there were times when Cubans were not allowed to come, but there were, there were people in Cuba, they were censored, but out of Cuba, there was censorship as well of the kinds of panels and papers that you would propose and what would get approved and what not. And also the way that, these decisions were made was not transparent. They were often taken there. So, so I didn't really appreciate the way that the section was being run and conducted. And, and like I said, I've been like not involved for over a decade, so I can't speak about now. I know that there were changes after. So anyway, so then, I did Ethno-Cuba, and actually we are now at more than 800, I believe.
Wow.
And, and everybody's vetted and everybody's connected to academia one way or another. And, and so that became really lively. And now there are other groups, and, LASA has also its own group, but, but we are the oldest, and so, yeah, so in a way that gave me visibility too within the Cuban community when I was like fresh out of the PhD, really. And then I always wanted to write for the public. And so, so that's why I created Cuba Counterpoints. And I think also that perhaps it came too soon in a way, because now there are many academic sort of publications that they are for the public, but, where scholars write. But when we started Cuba Counterpoints like 6 or 7 years ago, there weren't outlets where, of course, academics always wrote op-eds, but not even that much. But, but to have a publication that, kind of like NACLA, that will be considered, but sometimes NACLA is even very academic, right? So to have a publication that will, have also lighter sections. So it will not be just like a blog where there's one post a day, which is what NACLA does, but a real magazine with sections and audio visuals and, and dispatches, we had a section. So, so that didn't exist, but unfortunately, it was not sustainable because, these things don't make money, and I did not succeed at fundraising. Maybe, so I know that that's my weakness. There are people who are much more talented at fundraising, and I wasn't. And so, so it's there, and I don't know if it will ever be revived, or, like you and I have talked now and then about ideas of how to shape it, change it, modify it, maybe make it about more and not just about Cuba, or, I don't know, it's there, and, and it's open if somebody wants to take it in and shape it. But, but unfortunately, I also, after a while, it was really tolling to ask people to write and not pay them. And so if you really want commentary on what happened yesterday, so you want somebody to stop what they're doing and write something today, you have to pay them, right? And then the Cubans, they had no money. We needed to pay them too. So we got a little bit of money, but it was not enough. The work of the editors was gruesome. Sometimes it was like full time. So it was unsustainable. We were working a lot, and it was also at some point, you just could not demand much of writers if you're not paying them.
Now, which of course is, as you're speaking about this and the challenges, I keep going back to Mr. Weiwei and the breaking of the of the pottery, because there's this extraordinary disconnect, in a sense, a cultural disconnect between the sense that what he did when it was done by the Dominican has this extraordinary value, that even putting his name on it has value, but that the product of cultural production in writing, especially by academics, does not.
Right.
And so there's this odd thing about valuing. There's an art to Cuba counterpoints, which tends to be as undervalued as the performances of a well-known person who positioned himself quite strategically to become the darling of people with a lot of money and perhaps less, well, anyway, a lot of money.
Yeah, but you know, like this article that I wrote on NACLA, for NACLA, I mean, I actually wrote it and then I decided I would send it to NACLA because there were not those many outlets, but that was perfectly fitting. I mean, within hours, thousands of people had read it, you know, and I got called from the New York Times. I've done all sorts of Zooms. It has circulated in a way that no book, edited volume, academic article ever did or will.
Right. No, exactly. The problem is that, is it possible for an artist or a writer to feed herself from telephone calls from the New York Times?
No, but see, but this in a way, that will be the market, right? I mean, like you know, like people who, you know, like if you have a salary, you can do it. So that's really not sustainable. But then on the other hand, if you have a salary to write stuff that nobody's going to read, because, you know, I understand a scientist that is discovering stuff, and you know, I'm a social scientist myself, but you know, as we know from, you know, the history of scientific revolutions, also in the social sciences, you know, the paradigms are changed once a generation. And so 99.5% of what's being published, it doesn't go anywhere. It just like falls into oblivion, but it might help that person get a salary raise.
Yeah.
But that's a huge disconnect, right? And so in a way, I think that split that we've seen in the United States and in Europe with the art and also with architecture and design of, okay, this is the market, but we want to change society, or we want to foster civic participation. We want to work, you know, to as hard as it is towards a more just, equitable society. I think that many artists have internalized that, and they understand that maybe they need to play the two, you know, with the two sets of cards. But I don't think academics have understood that. Some have, but many haven't. Right? And so I think it's about time that, you know, that they do, because I will argue that right now, you know, being just like within your niche, it's the equivalent of the market, because those are the ones, you know, it's like your department is buying your articles, and it's giving you, you know, $5,000 more next year or something, right? And so you are within that market. So in a way, it's the same kind of like prostitution, because you're writing stuff that in some cases you don't believe in, but you have to fulfill this so that then you get money in exchange. But you have completely forgotten. And of course, you know, I'm making a bit of a caricature, but you know, you can argue that you're trying to change society by changing your students, but not by, you know, many of these publications. So what, you know, so it's also a market that it's really not sustainable. You know, I'm hoping for it to bust, because, you know, like you have these companies that, you know, Elsevier and you know, and Wiley, that control the databases and the journals, and they are the, you know, and they sell to libraries, and they make so much money with your articles, but you don't make a penny. In fact, every time you publish in an academic press or journal, you are relinquishing your rights to them, you know, and they have to give you permission if you want to reprint it. And so, you know, so this very twisted market that it's academia, you know, that it's a little bit of a bubble. I think it needs to burst, and it needs to change.
And who knows with the kinds of shocks that we've been getting over the course of the last 10 years or so.
Right, yeah. So people tell me, well, be careful of saying this because then you're playing with the neoliberals that they want to eliminate academia. I don't agree with what they want to do, but I also know that the current system, it's absurd and it's untenable and, it's not doing that much. It needs to be reformed. That's what I think. And I do think that I was told that I don't know if this is true, but that in Australia faculty get points for publishing for the public, and this is why a publication like The Conversation has been so successful, because everybody wants to publish there because it has this big popular audience. And so so I think that should be there, should like the social sort of consciousness obligations of academics in whatever is it that they believe in, whatever their particular party affiliation, I think that there should be more of a demand of, on social participation on the part of particularly social scientists. I understand that, there's so much you can demand from an archaeologist or a linguist that works, but, or a medieval historian. But even a medieval historian has things to say about what's happening now,
Yeah, this would be the rise of Bordeaux's notion of the public intellectual now gone crazy.
Right. Definitely.
Last question for you. I know we've been going on quite a bit. And so I want to end maybe by looking to the future. And I've been just fascinated with your work in Hialeah and the Miami community. And I was, maybe we can wrap up our conversation by you talking a little bit about what you're doing now and your work now and in the future.
Well, I've been, I've been working, I had been working in this issue of, ideology and electoral politics in Hialeah. And this year, there was the plan with, a think tank to do a big ethnographic research, but it fell through because of the pandemic. And then, because I still did some interviews on my own and stuff, I published this article. But I think that that I'm going to wrap up everything that I have, because a few years ago I did fieldwork at a television station, and I have this manuscript on mostly on comedy and performance, and a lot of it has to do with race and of course with immigration and so on. So I need I need to write that up, and I'm still interested in political anthropology and ideology and crafting discourses and stuff. So so I'm interested in kind of like practical applications. What do you do with all of this if you want to change things? And so so the sort of the near future is wrapping up all these manuscripts, papers that I have from work that I've been doing in the last few years.
Oh my God! Now you're making me feel guilty.
Yeah, and then and then hopefully it's like I will not mind being more involved in in politics in terms of like I said, crafting discourse, strategizing. I've sort of advised informally a couple of candidates, and I love to do that.
Ay, Dios mío, comandante. Oh, fabulous. Well, this has just been marvelous. You have no idea how grateful I am for you to take the time out.
Thank you for inviting me. That's
not at all. Any last words?
No, maybe, I guess would be questions, but I don't know if this is the moment to ask. I mean, what does the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy expects to be doing during the new Biden government? I mean, do you think that you can sort of have a seat at the table on whatever new, policies are going to be crafted with regards to remittances and connections with Cuba? How is the association being active in that sense?
The question is well timed and well placed, but it's also a delicate one. The association is grounded on being completely apolitical.
I see.
And so we pride ourselves on being able to put out the same kind of analysis and the same aid, irrespective of who happens to be in the White House or the Senate or in the administrative units. My hope is that we will continue to remain ever more current and offer advice from our perspective to anyone who is willing to take it. You know, it really is almost a story of the old lady in the turnip markets. I keep this my image of the day, right? I've got my turnip. It's a great turnip. It really is profoundly interesting. I don't care who buys it. If you've got the power to cook it and eat it and learn from it, then my God, don't take it, but we'd love for you to give us a donation too, as we've been talking about with Cuba Counterpoints. But right, so we will be doing some analysis of what the change in administration is likely to hold, but we will continue to adhere to the notion that what we do is apolitical. We've got no affiliation,
Yeah.
and of course, it's a big tent.
Right.
Political parties tend to be smaller and smaller tents. It's a big tent, and there's a fairly broad spectrum of political views. But again, in terms of our work, the work would be apolitical, not, as we suggested, not scholarly in that traditional detached way, but more in the way of analysis. This is what we see. This is, you know, if X, then Y. Here's foundational ideology you ought to be working with and the like. So we'll see. And we hope that in that process, we will be able to call on you and others like you to aid us in these projects. There's a lot of work that is likely to pop up after 2020.
Yeah, and on this side, I used to write for a magazine that was Cuba Trade Magazine, remember?
Yeah.
So I used to write for them. It disappeared, but I wrote an article on the Chinese stores that you know, that Cubans here brought stuff, and you know, I suppose they are all closed. But yeah, anyway, there is a lot to do on this side regarding trade, also at the grassroots level.
Exactly.
So, okay,
Exactly.
well, we continue to be continued.
Exactly. So thank you very, very much. I hope our audience enjoyed this. Please send or direct questions and comments to us, and we would be happy to continue conversations. So again,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you very much.